Okay, guys. This is It Walks at Midnight, and it is a dramatic reading from The Scariest Stories You've Ever Heard, Part 2 by Katherine Burt. So, It Walks at Midnight. Mike and Rob loved hiking in the countryside near the college they attended in Kentucky. Along with Mike's dog Ernie, they had been to most of the state parks in their area, but they were especially excited about the next hike they were going to take. They were going to the fantastic Red River Gorge over spring vacation. "Look at those cliff walls," said Rob on the hike into the gorge. "Awesome," answered Mike. "They're even steeper than I thought they'd be." After hiking for most of the afternoon, setting up camp, and then fixing dinner, they were pretty tired. Even Ernie, who had been exploring all over, looked beat. They were relaxing around the campfire, looking up at the sky and listening to the night sounds. The full moon made everything look a little spooky. Mike tossed another log on the fire. They watched as the sparks floated up into the darkness. Rob reached down to scratch Ernie's ears, but Ernie was gone. "Hey," asked Rob, "did you hear Ernie run off?" "No," answered Mike, "but don't worry, he'll come back." But just then they heard a yelping and whimpering coming from somewhere out in the dark woods. They both recognized Ernie's bark and stood up. Mike grabbed his flashlight and they started walking in the direction of the whimpering. "Here, Ernie, come here, boy," they called. Soon they heard a rustling sound in the thick underbrush. A minute later, Ernie came bursting out of the bushes and ran toward Mike. The poor dog was trembling all over, and the fur on his back was sticking straight up. "Hey, what's wrong, Ernie?" asked Mike. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Ernie just whimpered and hid behind Mike's legs. "Whatever's in there sure scared Ernie," said Rob. "Maybe it's a bear or a wildcat." Mike shined his flashlight into the dark woods where Ernie had come running out. The shadows of the trees and all the leaves made lots of fantastic shapes. "Look up there," whispered Rob, pointing to a small ledge about 20 feet above the ground. What is it?" Mike whispered. "It's not like any bear I've ever seen," Rob said. "It looks more like a huge black dog." On the ledge, staring down at them in the moonlight, with eyes that seemed to glow like little points of red fire, stood a large black dog. "Look at the way he's moving his head," Mike said. "It's almost like he's trying to tell us something." "Yeah, like, get out of here," answered Rob. "I think that's pretty good advice." "No, I don't think so," said Mike. "Look at his eyes. I think he wants us to come with him somewhere." "You must be kidding. That dog looks like a monster," Rob replied. "Now look what he's doing." As Rob and Mike watched in amazement, the huge black dog seemed to float up into the air. It floated back up the side of the cliff wall, and with one final piercing stare down at them, turned and disappeared without a sound. A minute later, they heard a blood-curdling howl from somewhere off in the distance. It sounded half-human, almost like a person crying in agony. The guys could barely sleep that night, and the next morning they went to the ranger station to report what they had seen. When they had told their story to the ranger, he sighed. "I'll be honest with you guys," he said. "You aren't the first to report seeing that dog, or whatever it was. The stories are always pretty much the same. And it's always people camping in that area where you guys were. To tell you the truth, I almost expected someone to report it today." "Why?" asked Mike. "Why today?" "Because last night was a full moon," the ranger answered. "The creature is only seen on the night of the full moon. Then it disappears." "Well, do you know what it is?" asked Rob. "No, we don't. It could be a dog that's gone wild, or a wolf or bear that people didn't get a very good look at. Or," the ranger said after a pause, "it could be a ghost." "But," said Mike. "I know, I don't believe in ghosts either," the ranger said. "But when you're out in the gorge alone on a moonlit night, you start thinking about all the stories and legends you've heard. Sometimes you start to think that anything could happen in there." Mike and Rob remembered the unearthly howl and the dog's piercing, fiery eyes. Maybe the ranger was right. Anything could happen in there. They were getting up to leave when Mike remembered something. "Did any of the other people report that the dog seemed to be trying to tell them something?" he asked. The ranger gave him a serious look. Then he said, "As a matter of fact, another person did notice that the dog seemed to be moving his head in a strange way, like he was trying to point somewhere." "Yeah, that's what he did," said Mike excitedly. "That person was me," said the ranger. "After I read some of the reports, I decided to go try to see the thing myself. After seeing it, I didn't know what to think." "Listen," said Rob, who had been quiet for a while. "Have you checked through old records and reports to see if anybody has lost a dog?" "Yeah, I looked through all that stuff in my office, which goes back 10 years. Anything older than that would be at the district warehouse in Stanford." "That's where our college is," said Rob. "We could check the old records." That would be great, said the ranger, but the stuff is old and messy. It would be a big job. Those records go back into the last century. We'll give it a try, said Mike. It was a busy time at school, and Rob and Mike didn't have much time for the search. They did finally get to spend a whole Saturday looking through the musty old report files. Farther and farther back in time they went. It was interesting to read about all the different things people had lost throughout the years. Someone in 1928 had lost a Model T Ford. After 6 hours of searching and sneezing from all the dust, they were about to give up. Then Mike held up an old yellowed piece of paper with some faded writing on it. "Take a look at this," he said. The report was from June 22nd, 1935. It told of a 10-year-old boy who had been camping in the gorge with his family. He wandered off on a rainy evening and never came back. The family and park rangers searched for him, but his body was never found. Stapled to the back of the report was a piece of notebook paper. Mike read it aloud. The family's dog, a black Labrador retriever named Midnight, was also never found. "We have to show this to the ranger," cried Rob. They arranged with the ranger to drive out on the afternoon of the next full moon. He met them at the door of the ranger station. "I checked the almanac for 1935, he said. June 22nd was a full moon. Together, all three hiked back into the area where Mike and Rob had seen the dog a month earlier. Ernie seemed nervous to be back where he had gotten such a fright. The sky began to cloud over as they set up camp in the same place. "Looks like it could drizzle," said the ranger. "It's starting to look like that day in 1935, said Mike. "The report said it was rainy." Mike, Rob, and the ranger sat quietly after dinner, waiting for something they knew might never show up. Mike didn't know which would be worse, if the dog never appeared or if it did. Maybe he didn't want to know the dog's strange secret. Maybe it was better to just leave such things alone. The campfire was burning low. Ernie was sleeping at Mike's feet. It hadn't rained, but the fog and mist had descended into the gorge, making them feel more alone than ever. Suddenly, Ernie's ears pricked up. He sniffed once or twice and then became stiff with fear. He started to tremble and whimper. Mike petted the frightened dog and said softly, "I think it's here." They all looked up through the mist to the same ledge. There stood the great black dog. The fog made the dog's fiery eyes seem even brighter. Mike tied Ernie's leash to a log and whispered, "Stay here, boy." Mike, Rob, and the ranger slowly stood up and walked toward the cliff where the dog stood motionless. Through the mist, they all noticed again the strange way the dog moved his head. When they were as close to the ledge as they could come without climbing, Mike nodded at Rob. Rob took a deep breath and called out through the mist in a voice made hoarse by fear. "Midnight! Midnight! Take us where you want us to go. We'll follow you." What the dog did next sent chills of terror up the spines of all three of them. He turned his blazing eyes directly at them and howled, an unearthly howl, up at the fog-shrouded full moon. Then he half-walked, half-floated partway down the steep cliff wall. When the ranger shined his flashlight toward the dog, they saw that there was a small, hidden rock path leading up the face of the cliff. It had been hidden in the mist. "Come on," said Rob. "Midnight's showing us the path." They scrambled up the steep, rocky path. It was tough going, but they found that the dog waited for them. On and on the black dog led them, through thick bushes and underbrush, around wild rock formations, over giant boulders and thick tree roots. Every now and then the full moon broke through the thick trees and lit up the ghostly forest scene. And always the dog leading them on, waiting for them, his blazing red eyes leading the way. After 45 minutes, when they were deep into the gorge in an isolated place where none of them had ever been, Midnight stopped. He waited for them at the bottom of a tall, steep rock cliff. They could barely make out the top of the cliff. It had to be 40 feet up. Midnight stood on a small pile of rocks and dirt, which was overgrown with plants and bushes. In the light of the ranger's lantern shining through the fog, they watched as Midnight moved his head in an odd way again and again. He seemed to be directing them toward the mound of rocks. "That's where he wants us to look," whispered Mike. As if he had heard Mike's whisper, the great dog tilted back his head and howled at the full moon in a way that they had never heard a dog howl. The dog had in it 50 long years of sadness, heartbreak, and lonely wandering. It sounded human. Then, as they watched, the dog seemed to slowly float up and away from them. The last thing they saw was the fiery red eyes floating away in the mist. When the dog was gone, the ranger started to clear away the small pile of rocks and bushes where the dog had stood. Mike held the lantern. After a few minutes of digging with his shovel, the ranger uncovered something small and white. He picked it up and held it in the lantern's light. It was a bone. Working quickly, they soon found a small human skeleton, crumpled as if from a fall. The skull had a large crack in it. But touching the human skeleton was the skeleton of a huge dog. Around the dog's skeleton was a rotted leather collar that crumbled when Rob picked it up. Attached to the collar was a dog tag. Rob held it with shaking hands. As they read the name in the light of the lantern, they heard in the distance the strange, unearthly howl of the ghostly dog who had led them to this spot. The name on the dog tag was Midnight.